Have you ever played a game so much that over the years, it's sort of become a homestead of sorts for you? Like, no matter how happy, sad, healthy, or outright ill you are, you always come back to this game and find some deep sense of pleasure and enjoyment, of comfort in it. I had a game like that once, and it was Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis, which is also why I'm here today talking about what bootleggers happened to do to it over on the NES. You know, it's like the great author Thomas Wolfe once said in his book, The Web and the Rock. You can't go home again. Except for the fact that you totally can, which Wolfe himself said in his next book, which was actually titled, You Can't Go Home Again. Back in the late 80s, Nintendo was the de facto king of the world as far as video games were concerned. The NES and Famicom were as hot as a biscuit in the American and Japanese markets. Sega's Genesis had failed to really catch on to the degree that it would in the coming years, and at the center of it all was an iconic mascot that only kinda appropriated Italian culture. Seeing this success, the Famicom would go on to become a bit of a commodity amongst bootleggers. No, not the gin and tonic hawking bootleggers of the Prohibition era, but rather hardware and software bootleggers that would either produce 8-bit Nintendo clone consoles for markets that couldn't score the real thing, or create and adapt games for that market. And at the heart of Nintendo bootleg games are, somewhat unsurprisingly, a metric ton of bootleg Mario games, with the most iconic one arguably being Somari. Released in 1994 by Hummer Team, it's actually a bootleg remake of the first Sonic the Hedgehog game that lifts assets and concepts from Sonic 1 and 2 for the Genesis, but also from Sonic 1's Master System conversion, and happens to star Mario because, well, of course it does. It's also one of the most infamously terrible and buggiest games to ever make it to the market, which makes it the perfect candidate for the second episode of A Positive Spin, a show dedicated to looking at some of the worst games of all time and trying to find their silver linings. The Famicom bootleg scene is one of the most fascinating aspects of Nintendo's 8-bit lineage. It's home to delightful clone consoles like Russia's Dendy, untold heaps of demakes of popular titles for other consoles, and it's always had a bit of a soft spot in my heart. While I didn't grow up with any of the more iconic NES clone consoles like the Dendy or anything, I was raised with an NES, Genesis, and a delightful Syrian clone console known as the Sally game. Okay, so I actually couldn't find anything about this console online, so we'll have to rely on my memory here, but I distinctly remember getting this in about 1999 or 2000 when my dad and I were visiting family in Damascus, Syria. And as far as the console itself goes, it's honestly just your standard NES clone. It claims to have millions of games on the cartridge, which are usually just the same dozen or so games with a bunch of Game Genie codes added to them randomly. And it's also got this funky 6-button controller that looks like a fusion between like the Sega Saturn pad and the PlayStation 1 controller. I'll probably show that in B-roll right about now. And yeah, that's honestly all there is to it. And even though I'd love to go into greater detail about this console and might do a video about my experiences with it someday, I don't have the AC adapter for it anymore, and plus it isn't really the point of this video to begin with. In fact, the only reason I brought this up to begin with is because of a tangential relationship this console has to the namesake of this review. I distinctly remember playing a sprite-swapped version of Super Mario Bros. On it that added Sonic the Hedgehog to the game, and that, as a kid, it was one of my favorite ways to play the original Super Mario Bros. There was just something really novel about getting to experience one of the most iconic and enduring games of all time with the skin of another character on it for me. Anyway, when I was trying to get into retro gaming sometime in the mid to late 2000s, I actually tried to find that Mario Brothers ROM hack, which I believe is called Sonic Bros, by the way, and I ended up stumbling across Somari instead by accident. With my curiosity getting the better of me, I ended up downloading it, playing it, and yeah, I didn't like it that much. Don't get me wrong, Somari is a whole mess, but after revisiting it for this video some 10 to 15 years after my first experience with it, I genuinely had a pretty good time with the game. As a person that absolutely adores Sonic the Hedgehog and has always had a particular soft spot for his first game, I actually really liked getting to play through this and thought that it almost served as a worthwhile companion piece to Sonic's inaugural adventure. Sonic 1 is a really interesting game in the sense that discussions about its quality can sometimes feel like a bit of a Rorschach test. Depending on who you ask, Sonic 1 is either one of the greatest games of all time, a moderately flawed but still adequate first entry in a series that would slowly refine itself with its Genesis sequels, or a game that's totally overrated and was never that good to begin with.
Actually, there.
Sonic was never good.
Yeah,
It was a 25-year lie.
And Sonic 1 is a non-issue. It's a terrible game.
Sonic was never good. If you disagree, you can call the cops.
Also, the reason is they all want to have sex with Big the Cat.
Which is a take that people are certainly allowed to have, I suppose, though I personally don't agree with them. And while I personally fall somewhere between the first and second examples I just listed, I recently found myself a bit exhausted by the first Sonic game's offerings since reviewing it last year due to the simple fact that I've played it a million times already over the past decade. It's not so much that the game, or even myself, have changed that much since last year, but rather the fact that my relationship to the game has changed. Sonic 1 is a game that I'm deeply familiar with, and one that, thanks to the many iterations on it that have come out over the years, feels extremely comfortable to me in a way that makes it somewhat lacking in the excitement I felt for it when I first played it as a kid. Heck, my overwhelming comfort with the game is one of the prevailing reasons that I haven't reviewed Sonic 3 for this channel yet, or why I've also held off on covering the Sonic Advance series. Despite the fact that Sonic is without a doubt my favorite video game character of all time, I simply can't bring myself to get excited about him at the moment. Or at least couldn't bring myself to get excited about until I actually sat down and played this game for a bit. Somari forced me to take a good long look at the mechanics of 2D Sonic games, and by providing me a broken, borderline unplayable version of those same mechanics, it led to me garnering a greater sense of appreciation for those 2D Sonic titles. Which is kind of funny, you know? Like, it's interesting to have this Frankenstein's monster of Mario and Sonic serve as a reminder for how amazing Sonic the Hedgehog was in the first place. Yeah. Let's get on with the review now, shall we? Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a game that you've quite literally played to death? Like, something you've played so much over the years that you physically can't play it anymore for fear of physical illness or spontaneous combustion, but probably do anyway. Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And if you're new here and are enjoying what you see so far, feel free to subscribe to the channel and stuff so that you could check out all the other videos I'll be putting out in the future. And if you're into retro movies and TV shows, I also have a podcast called Media Obscura that talks about just that. So, you know, check it out if you're into that sort of thing. And with that out of the way, on with the video.
Home. I have no home.
Like I said earlier, Somari is an unlicensed Sonic 1 remake for Nintendo's 8-bit hardware. But despite that connotation and the fact that it features most of the Zone titles and aesthetics from the iconic Genesis game, it actually contains entirely new level designs for each of its stages that try to approximate the individual quirks of their namesakes. Except for Scrap Brain Zone, which is honestly kind of an improvement. Much like in Sonic 1 though, your objective is to reach the end of the stage in order to pass a goalpost or face Dr. Robotnik in a boss battle, and you have access to the same basic abilities that Sonic's known for, like jumping on enemies, collecting rings to offer yourself a means of protection, because honestly, wealth is but the ultimate body armor, both in video games and real life, I'm sure. rolling into a ball to attack enemies bowling style, and you can even perform Sonic's iconic spin dash that was introduced in his second game. However, while the inclusion of Sonic's spin dash is a novel idea in and of itself, that's not to say that I think it offers any utility to the player. Looking past the actual mechanics of the move here for just a second, Sonic's spin dash is an attack that usually calls for an extended level surface that Sonic 1's stages didn't really have. In fact, re-releases of Sonic 1 that had the move added to it for parity with its sequels felt like it had their level designs outright broken due to how much easier and faster the game became as a result of it. And while that sense of increased speed and the ramifications it had on the players looking to blaze through the game made for some amazing gameplay, Somari's levels are especially ill-equipped for such a feature. Oh, and before I forget, the move actually doesn't work right either to begin with. Popping a squat to let out a spin dash seems functional enough as a spectator, but if you were to pick up a controller and give it a shot, you'd quickly see that it's one of the most useless moves available to you due to how finicky the game's momentum and physics are. Without getting too scientific about it, releasing a charged up spin dash basically sends Somari moving forward at an extremely slow rate before randomly speeding up. And even though there's some semblance of consistency to how that works, it's something that's so radically unintuitive that you never quite get used to it. And that also happens to extend to the game's movement in general too, as running falls victim to the same exact acceleration problem. In fact, this problem is so rampant throughout the game that it makes the simplest of platforming challenges feel almost insurmountable, to the point where so many moments of this game feel like subversions of what you think a platformer should play like that it becomes pretty comical. I think the best way to describe it is that it's a bit like the castle siege scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You know the scene, the one where the two guards are out there and then we cut to this knight super far away running like... And then we cut back to the guards who are a little bit confused, and we cut back to the knight. And then we go back to the guards, followed by going back to the... And the guards again, and then once more to... Until suddenly... Yeah, it's a bit like that, honestly. I know it feels like I'm getting right into the negative aspects of this game awfully fast for a show that's literally dedicated to finding the good in otherwise bad or mediocre games, but there's simply no sidestepping it. Somari is an absolute mess of a game, and the fact that it fails to even accurately emulate what walking feels like in a Sonic game is a huge red flag. And it's compounded by the fact that nothing seems to work right in this game either. The game regularly succumbs to massive amounts of slowdown, there's a noticeable amount of input lag between when you press the jump button and the time it takes for you to actually... You'll regularly phase through walls in existence like you've just picked up the Vanish Cap in Mario 64, and as if that weren't enough, the game's level designs are interesting to say the least. And here I am, about to say that I couldn't get enough of it. But regardless of the fact that I probably shouldn't expect that much from an unlicensed Sonic bootleg to begin with, it's genuinely fascinating how utterly broken this game is. And because I'm trying to be more of an optimist in my life these days, I'd like to think that there was at least one lone engineer on this project that saw the writing on the wall and tried to speak to his superiors about it. Though I'm also sure that he either got laughed out of the room or, I don't know, like shot or something. I think a fair descriptor for how this game plays is that it feels a bit like a work of outsider art. In the same way that some of the quote-unquote worst movies of all time, like Plan 9 from Outer Space or Manos, The Hands of Fate, are beloved by thousands for their so bad they're good qualities, Somari is a head trip that's hard to explain, but undeniably appealing. There's a certain playfulness to how dysfunctional this game feels, and while it never comes across as fun in the traditional sense, it's also kind of a marvel to witness for yourself, even if the game's lack of continues can make it a painful experience unless you rely on the game's level select code or save states. And dare I suggest that it was actually kind of ambitious for Hummer Team to go the route of designing new levels for this game as opposed to throwing some slapdash variation of Sonic 1's levels together on the NES. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to call it punching weight worthy or anything, as these levels aren't good by any stretch of the word and do feature some pretty noticeable copying and pasting for sections of them, but it's kinda cool in and of itself, especially since you'd think that just doing the aforementioned alternative would have been a lot easier for them.
Plus, it's just kind of ballsy for them to have decided to make this a conversion of the Genesis version of Sonic 1 over just porting the already 8-bit Master System and Game Gear version of the game over instead. And it's not like they didn't know that version of the game existed either, because they literally cribbed its special stage and some of its assets from it.
Oh, and while I'm talking about the special stage, you've got to see this for yourself.
If you use the game's level select code to skip around, you can actually see that they misspelled this as being the game's spatial stage, which is funny in itself until you realize that the level takes place in space and that this typo is accidentally accurate because of it. Oh, and because I'm sure someone will try to call me out on it if I don't bring it up, they also misspelled Spring Yard Zone, but like, I don't know, I don't have like a dumb comment for that one, honestly. Going back to the level designs themselves though, Somari's reconfigurations of Sonic 1's stages definitely leaves a lot to be desired. For starters, some of these stages feature obstacles that completely fly in the face of your abilities, like spike pits that can't be escaped from in Green Hill Zone, an exceedingly unintuitive jump you need to make in Labyrinth Zone due to the game's momentum problems, or enemy placement that's so half-baked that simply trying to navigate through parts of a level are made a million times harder due to respawning enemies.
But I still can't help but have some respect for Hummer Team for deciding to make these stages from scratch to begin with, and I really can't help but have a bit more respect for them for deciding to try and actually remake the stage's respective gimmicks too on top of that.
Say what you will about these stages and their playability, but it's still kind of awesome that they went as far as to give Green Hill Zone its iconic loop-de-loops, or to recreate the water slide segments in Labyrinth Zone, and the heaps of springiness found in Spring Yard Zone. Sure, trying to actually use those things is harder than trying to find a penny in a large room with no light, but I guess I was just kind of surprised by how visually appealing some of these levels looked. Their color choices didn't always work, mind you, but they were still a valiant approximation of how the Genesis game looked and have their own kind of surreal charm to them. It's a bit like how Batman's sprite was purple in the Sunsoft NES game. Like, yeah, it was technically off, but it's so emblematic of the NES era that it's become endearing and nostalgic in and of itself.
But like, we all know that I gotta bring up this game's visual issues right about now anyway, right?
The game suffers from the same sort of visual artifacting that you see on other hardware-pushing NES games from the era, like Super Mario Bros. 3 or Felix the Cat, as well as have some sprite flicker and even some occasional visual glitches. The weirdest part about Somari for me visually though is how misleading many of its slopes are. Because the game is trying to emulate Sonic 1's level layouts and design philosophy, the game likes to include little inclines for you to run up and down that look simple enough to traverse, but quickly expose themselves as being awkward to run over due to the game's physics. And obvious and incoming irony aside, that issue kinda speaks to how disingenuous this entire game feels on a conceptual level. Somari does some pretty interesting and ambitious things for the NES, but fails to feel like it fully earned the right to try those things to begin with.
So for those that didn't know, Hummer Team allegedly made Somari by decompiling some of Sonic 2's source code and using it for the game, which, flagrant illegality aside, probably explains why it's so poorly optimized for the NES. So while the game does appear to make the NES do what Genesis does on some level, it is still running on an NES at the end of the day and is woefully outgunned for some of the tasks that it's being asked to do.
If I'm allowed to relate this game to a random movie I thought of the other day, it's kinda like Somari is the equivalent of Little Bow Wow's character in Like Mike, which was a movie that I'm sure a lot of you guys watching this either didn't know existed or had buried in the back of your psyche with other early 2000s memories, like when the CW was still WB, when Singular was a popular cell phone provider, and when Disney DVDs and tapes still opened with
Coming soon to own on video and DVD.
Much like that movie, which revolves around Little Bow Wow's character making his way to the NBA after happening upon a magic pair of sneakers that once belonged to Michael Jordan, Somari feels like the work of a group of, and I'm only assuming here, proficient enough engineers that happen to decompile Sonic 2's engine and get it kinda maybe sorta working on a Famiclone. However, unlike the movie, which ends with Little Bow Wow having to prove his worth without Michael Jordan's sneakers, the game never quite justifies its existence. A statement that thankfully doesn't apply to the aforementioned movie because it's a story about orphans and that would be totally terrible. And you honestly don't even have to look that hard to find better examples of this game's concept in action. Somari actually has a bit of a mod scene in and of itself and has been subjected to patches and fan hacks over the years that improve the gameplay by pretty noticeable amounts. I wouldn't say that these versions of the games make it a retail quality title or anything, but they do show what a bit more time in the oven could have done for the game as far as bug squashing and optimization goes. Oh, and Hummer Team themselves also couldn't help but revisit this game themselves too, for that matter.
So I was never really able to tell the story that I wanted to tell. I had to self-censor the story down to something I knew could be done given the technology I had available. So later on I had the opportunity of fixing them up, and I said, well, this is a great chance for me to experiment with a new technology.
As far as the internet seems to know, there are actually 4 different versions of Somari that Hummer Team worked on, which for the most part were simple sprite swaps to feature a new character that are usually Sonic, a new title screen to go with it, and a couple of bug fixes. Honestly though, outside of the version they released called the Speeding Hummer, which features an original character and some color-swapped sprites to make the whole thing feel a bit less Sonic-y, there isn't really that much to go into with these games. They're all just kinda Somari, but with Sonic in it. Or not in that other game's case. And that change kinda just nullifies some of this game's surrealist appeal for me.
You know, you could call me a masochist, a glutton for punishment, or you could call me Al, but I feel like trying to play a quote-unquote improved version of Somari almost defeats the purpose of seeking this game out to begin with.
Because while I'm all for games being improved by fan hacks or patches and stuff, what's really the point of polishing the infamously bad 8-bit remake of Sonic 1 when you could just play Sonic 1 instead? Yeah, it's excruciatingly difficult due to its general bugginess. It has a version of Labyrinth Zone that's somehow worse than the Genesis version of the same stage, and a lot of its music does want to make me cake my face in heaps of mascara, curl up into a ball, and cry until I look like a cross between a Jackson Pollock painting and Alice Cooper, but I feel like that's also a huge part of the experience.
It probably goes without saying, but games like Somari most likely have unironic fans that genuinely love the title for providing an alternative to Sonic the Hedgehog in regions where they probably couldn't get actual Sonic games at the time.
Because the Genesis wasn't released in countries like China or Russia back in the day, Somari was developed as an alternative to Sonic the Hedgehog for those regions or for Famicom owners that didn't get a Mega Drive. And in much the same way that popular movies back then ended up getting heavily bootlegged or straight up unlicensed quote-unquote remakes for regions where the original was either unavailable legally or prohibitively expensive, Somari was an attempt to bring Sega's brand of blast processing goodness to the masses.
Now, that doesn't mean that I view Hummer Team as some sort of working class hero with the noble intention of sharing green hills and spatial stages with the masses, though wouldn't that be something? Rather, I just wanted to remind everyone that the actual tangible quality of Somari probably didn't matter that much at the end of the day. And that no matter how good or bad the game itself actually was, a lot of its appeal came from the fact that it was a weird Frankenstein's monster of 2 popular franchises. One sec, guys.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
As I was just saying, Somari is an interesting game because of its relationship to Mario and Sonic 1. And as I mentioned at the start of this video, getting to play through this forced me to take a good long look at what actually makes Sonic 1 a good game in the first place. And Somari managed to do that by being the bizarro Superman to Sonic 1's Clark Kent.
This may be a problem that's exclusive to me for whatever reason, but after spending the majority of my life playing Sonic 1, I feel as though sitting down to play through the game again has become a somewhat perfunctory task for me. Perhaps unsurprisingly, playing the same game every so often for over 20 years has instilled me with enough muscle memory to make running through the first game feel a bit automated. But while I was playing Somari, I felt like that was being challenged by how overtly unpolished the game was. Simple tasks like rolling up a hill or making some accurate jumps went from things that I could do with my eyes closed to borderline Herculean feats of patience, a counterintuitive application of my dexterity, and a fair amount of luck. On top of that, even though Somari is superficially a remake of Sonic the Hedgehog, it doesn't really understand what makes that game as flat out addictive as it was. A huge part of the original Sonic the Hedgehog's appeal was how, aside from being a solid platformer, its best stages felt like a bit of a sandbox for the player to traverse in a variety of different ways. The levels had multiple pathways, secrets, and enough rings laid about to make things feel forgiving enough to make players want to experiment with how they approach things.
And Somari doesn't.
Like I mentioned earlier in the review, Somari's levels may look like their Genesis counterparts and even feature some of their stage gimmicks, but they never quite recapture their respective sparks. They all just feel a bit too linear for their own good, and while there are occasional secrets strewed about them, they're either a bit too obviously or carelessly placed for their own good. Even something as simple as the game's ring placement feels like it was just kinda done to check off a box of similarities to the Genesis game. While the game is similar to the Genesis version of Sonic 1 in the sense that you can recover a couple of them as a means of insurance after getting hit,
once again because, wealth is the ultimate body armor.
Actually managing to reliably do so is another task entirely thanks to the game's general glitchiness. In brief, the overt and seemingly unintentional difficulty of Somari serves as a means to better appreciate the fundamentals that Sonic the Hedgehog nails. Because say what you will about that first Sonic game compared to its sequels, but it's a solid game, and while it does feature slower and duller zones like Marble or Labyrinth Zone, the 8-bit rendition of those stages presented in Somari make them feel like an all-expense-paid vacation by comparison.
And the same basic idea applies to Sonic 1's greatest asset, its physics.
Back in my Sonic 1 review from last year, I briefly touched upon the idea that the game's physics and sense of inertia were a huge part of what made it stand out against the competition of the time. There's something inherently addictive about being able to curl into a ball and have the momentum you've built up while you were running carry you into an enemy or along a slope or loop. And while Somari does try to emulate these qualities, at least superficially, it's far from successful in actually doing so and leaves you with a version of Sonic 1 that feels completely devoid of what made it special in the first place. Even worse, it doesn't even try to substitute Sonic's expected physics for the physics of another game. It just hands you a broken take on the original and leaves you out to dry, forcing you to rely on luck or sheer willpower to get through some of its challenges. And last, Somari even manages to bolster the one part of Sonic the Hedgehog that probably didn't need a glow up from me to begin with. Its soundtrack. You hear that? That's what it sounds like when a star dies.
In about 10 billion years, our very own sun will finally expire, and frankly, I'm sure that song will still be out there somewhere for whoever or whatever's out there to be tortured by.
Somari's soundtrack is, frankly, one of the most depressing things you'll probably ever listen to. While these songs are technically Masato Nakamura's iconic compositions from the Genesis game, a lot of them have been garbled and mangled to the point of no return and often bear little to no resemblance to their 16-bit iterations. Honestly, while I do think a few of these versions do have their own little charms to them, namely the game's version of Marble Zone's theme, which isn't too bad as far as I'm concerned, the vast majority of them are off-key, high-pitched renditions that often feel like they aren't even getting played in the right time signature to begin with. And I guess they do make me appreciate the originals more and stuff, but I wasn't exactly dragging them through the dirt to begin with.
At the end of the day, Somari is a really weird game, but it's also a title that I'm glad that I got to play through. It isn't good, at all, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I did feel like I owed it a tiny bit of gratitude for existing in the first place. Aside from the innate surrealness of its existence to begin with, I actually had a lot of fun playing it out of this sort of morbid curiosity for what lay in its contents. And on top of that, I love the fact that it actually led to me finding a greater sense of appreciation for Sonic 1 by being just so bad.
Well, I suppose I never actually lost sight of that fact. I really did mean it when I said that years of playing the game had led to a general fatigue towards it on my part, as well as a sort of mindless approach to playing it. But by playing Somari and more or less getting forced to contemplate every aspect of its design due to the years of muscle memory I'd developed for Sonic 1, I generally feel like Sonic the Hedgehog is all the fresher an experience for me now because of it. A pretty decent analogy for the feeling I got from playing this game is that I feel a bit like Jimmy Stewart's character George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. Only instead of wishing I had never been born as I awaited my arrest due to a financial discrepancy I wasn't actually to blame for, I got to play a version of Sonic the Hedgehog that wasn't particularly good.
Though I'm also sure that we as mature individuals can all agree that the latter of the two fates is by far the worst one to be stuck with.
In the same way that old George Bailey got to see how bad everyone around him's lives would have been without him, playing Somari felt a bit like getting to experience a version of Sonic 1 that didn't have all of the game's redeeming qualities.
And just like George Bailey was able to return home at the end of the movie a changed and happier man with a new outlook on life, I like to think that Somari has allowed me to return back to the metaphorical home that Sonic 1 represents to me. But like, what do I know? This could also just be a sign that I need to play a bit less Sonic 1, you know?
Either way, I thought Somari was a fun experience. If you ever decide to give the game a shot, I recommend playing the original version of it in all its buggy glory, as while it's definitely the roughest way to play Sonic 1 aside from maybe its Game Boy Advance port, it's also an extremely interesting and memorable one.
Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I owe someone a tiny bit of an apology. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you haven't already, you remember to leave an answer to the question of the day down in the comments. On top of that, feel free to like the video or subscribe to the channel, share it with a friend, or do whatever you want to help the channel grow. And if you really enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a small donation of however much you want on my Buy Me a Coffee page to show some appreciation for the channel. You could also look me up on Twitter and Instagram by searching for @NichePlays on those respective apps, or by following the links down in the description down below. And if you haven't gotten sick of my voice yet for whatever reason, you could also check out my retro movie and TV podcast, Media Obscura. It's hosted by myself alongside my girlfriend Sierra and my best friend Raekwon. We talk about old movies, TV shows, and stuff for an hour or two every 2 or 3 weeks, and it's a generally laid back and, at least as far as I'm concerned, pretty fun ride. Our latest episode either just came out a few days before this episode's out or will come out in a couple of days, and it's about retro commercials of all things. So if that's your cup of tea, go check it out. So yeah. Bye.